Number 1. Ronnie. In the town I grew up in, you were able to continue trick-or-treating up to 15 years old. For me, I always went out with my friend Ronnie. Hell, I remember going trick-or-treating with him before I began going to school. He was my good buddy, and we had a pretty good night planned for our last trick-or-treating outing. On that night, Ronnie was going to go as a ghost. Yeah, it wasn't the most original costume, but that is why he picked it. It was a classic, and he wanted to go out with a bang. Ronnie got to my house about 45 minutes later than he was supposed to. He knocked on the door, and I got a good look at his costume. It was a pretty cool one. He took a white sheet and tied some swing set chains onto it. Plus, interestingly enough, he had some fake blood splattered on the outfit as well. I thought it was pretty cool to see blood on a ghost. Anyway, he had his trick-or-treat bag, the one he always brought out. Ronnie really didn't talk much that night. He went through the night making ghost noises. For example, he would go like, "Ooh," instead of "trick-or-treat" when we got up to a doorway. And he still got candy, of course, because everyone thought it was really neat. It's cool to get into the act, you know. But Ronnie was way too into the act. I mean, being in character is fine, but there's not really a need to always be in character. When I asked him questions, he just kept making ghost noises. Honestly, it began to get a little irritating after a while. Pretty late into the night, we were walking by a graveyard on the side of town. When we got up to the gate, he walked up to it. He motioned me to follow him into the graveyard. That was a bit much for me for several reasons. First, I really don't like breaking into a graveyard. It's disrespectful to the dead, and I'm not big on trespassing anyway. But he was standing there, and it looked like the gate was open. Ronnie kept motioning to me, indicating that he wanted to go into the graveyard. I told him no, and kept trying to walk away. Ronnie then started dancing around me, putting his arms up in the air, and making all sorts of weird and spooky ghost noises. And he wasn't trying to force me or anything, just trying to indicate that I was a chicken for not following him into the graveyard. Several times I told him to cut it out, and the act was getting tiresome. He kept at it though. It was much more obnoxious than usual for him. Finally, I snapped at him and told him that he was getting to be very annoying. When I snapped at Ronnie, he stopped, and he cocked his head to the side, and then to the other side. He was obviously aggravated or something. He waved me off and then took off in the opposite direction. I immediately felt bad about snapping at my friend. I called after him, telling him I was sorry and that I didn't want our last trick-or-treat to end on a bad note. He didn't listen though, he just kept walking. I kept up after him for a bit, and then finally decided to give up. My evening had been ruined, and then I just had to go home. At my house, no one was there. My parents had gone to a party, thus I was not surprised. I had some candy and then went to bed. It was pretty early in the morning when my mom woke me up. She was very, very distressed. She wouldn't tell me why right away, though. I had to get out of bed and then go down to the kitchen, where a police officer was waiting. I was worried, wondering if I had done something wrong, but it wasn't like that. The officer asked me a couple questions about my night on Halloween. When I was finished answering them, he then told me what had happened. My best friend Ronnie had been found in the graveyard. He was barely alive, but conscious. Apparently, he had been crossing through the graveyard on the way to my house, and he got attacked by a guy from school that we both knew. He had been beaten and stabbed. The bully then took his costume, along with Ronnie's wallet and trick-or-treat bag. I felt for my friend, but the reality of what happened nearly overpowered me. I was trick-or-treating with a guy who had beaten and stabbed my best friend, and that guy tried to get me to go into the graveyard that Ronnie had been found in. Number 2. Rural trick-or-treat. I remember this very freaky encounter that I had when I was a teenager. I grew up, as my parents would tell me, out in the country. We weren't very far away from town, though. I don't want you to think that, although we lived in the country, that it was completely away from civilization. Now, when I was very young, I remember we used to go for trick-or-treating by driving from house to house in the country. However, due to safety reasons, there was a law passed that all trick-or-treating had to be done in the town. So maybe when I was 8, we stopped driving door to door. And since then, I've never had anyone come to my house for it. When I was 16, my parents had gone out of town for a few days. I remained home all by myself because I'm an only child. They would be gone on Halloween, but it was not something I was concerned about, because I was too old to go trick-or-treating anyway, and I really loved being home alone. It was maybe around 8 when I heard a knock at the door. I froze, not having expected anything or anyone. I had all the lights off in the house, and our porch light worked by motion sensors, so my presence in the house would not have been obvious to anybody who was outside. I thought it would be better for me to take a peek outside and see who it was, rather than open the door. I peeked out a side window where I could see on the porch. There was a very large man on the porch, and he was in a costume. It reminded me, if you have ever seen the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde Looney Tunes cartoon, Jekyll turned into the huge green-skinned creature wearing a top hat and jacket. It reminded me of that. He had an axe up on his shoulder, and he was carrying a large pillowcase in the other one. The pillowcase was dragging on the floor. My immediate thought was, of course, to just pretend like I wasn't home. Perhaps he would be there for a few moments and then just leave. Perhaps he had come to the wrong house or something. I wasn't sure. But I just hid behind the curtain at the window, and I watched him as he stood on the porch. He knocked hard on the door again, and this time I heard him yell, "Trick or treat." After my initial surprise, I then began thinking that this was a dangerous person. I know that might seem odd, that I hadn't come to that conclusion before, but what it seemed like to me was someone too old for trick-or-treating, who also was out in the rural part of the county, where I mentioned that trick-or-treating was not allowed. I really didn't know what to do. I listened to a lot of scary YouTube stories, and I read comments where people criticize the person telling the story for not calling the police right away. But when you're in a situation like this, and not just listening to someone else telling the story, it's not as easy as you might think to call the police. I mean, I was mesmerized just watching the guy on the porch and wondering what this odd person was up to. What would I have told them anyway? Hey, Mr. Hyde from the Bugs Bunny cartoon is on my porch and is trick-or-treating. And the man yelled, "Trick or treat," a few more times. He then walked over to one of the windows on the porch and tried to look in the house. He repeated this with several more of the windows, and then I noticed him looking in my direction. I don't think he noticed me, but he was just trying to look in all the windows, and when he began walking toward mine, I quickly laid down on the floor, under the window. Hiding under the window was much scarier than seeing the guy had been. At least when I noticed him, I knew where he was. As I lay under the window pane, I had no idea. I was about to get up and peek again, when I heard him tap on the window. I stayed on the floor. He tapped a few more times, and then it was quiet. I lastly heard a sound of something crushing, and then it was quiet. When I finally had the nerve to get up, I peeked out the window again. My jack-o'-lantern was destroyed, and there was no one on the porch. However, that was really not very comforting. And my nerves were completely shot, and I was not able to relax for the rest of the night. I got a phone call in the morning from a friend of mine who had lived in the country too, not too far from my house. She explained seeing the man I had seen, and that his behavior was similar too. Her parents had gone to a party, and she was alone with her little brother. She had grabbed her father's rifle and had to threaten to shoot the guy if he wouldn't leave. There are some weird people out there, and many of them come out on Halloween. Number 3. Attic. I have a pretty good setup for trick-or-treating on Halloween. I inherited a really big house from my aunt when she passed away, It basically had 3 stories, but I guess you could consider the top floor to be an attic. It doesn't have a lot of insulation in it, and no trapdoor or ladder. It's just a regular staircase, though much more narrow than the other ones in the house. Much of my aunt's possessions were still in there, and I rarely went up there for any reason. The best part of the house was that it did indeed just look like a creepy old house. It also had a really huge porch. I was able to really deck it out with decorations on Halloween. I had all sorts of neat things on the porch and in the yard. It was relatively warm enough also that I could hang out on the porch in a rocking chair while the kids came and trick-or-treated. And that was my first Halloween since I'd been in the house. I had no idea what trick-or-treating was like in that town, but I wasn't disappointed. I mean, the neighborhood came out in full force. It was amazing how crowded the streets and sidewalks got, but I loved it. And the kids seemed to like my overdone decorating approach. About an hour into the event, I was having the time of my life. A couple of children came up to my house, and I gave them some candy. Before leaving, though, a kid who may have been around 8 years old told me, "I like the ghost in your attic window," and he left. It should have given me more pause than it did. I, of course, knew that I had not decorated the attic, and I didn't put anything in the window. The kids say things, you know, and you don't always know why. I just went back to doing my thing. I had pretty much forgotten about the kid, when about a half hour later, another kid mentioned seeing someone in my attic window. This kid didn't say a ghost, but it was a similar statement. My attic has a big window, with a window seat built under it, so if you wanted to, you could just sit in the window and watch the neighborhood. But I assumed that the kids were just seeing things. Still, I kept paying attention to the children as I walked up to the porch, and I noticed that several of them seemed to be looking up in the direction of the window. Finally, way too curious to just let it go, I got up and walked off the porch. I looked up at the attic window. One of the outside lights on the house was right above that window, so I would have been able to see if anyone was actually in the window. So I looked, and I really didn't see anything. And for a moment, I just assumed that the kids had been seeing things, but then I distinctly saw a large black shape moving in the window. And there was definitely someone or something in my attic. I did the only thing that I could do. I called the police. But it was really problematic since the streets were littered with children. It took forever for them to get to my house, and I kept giving out candy while it was happening. I was so distracted though, feeling uncomfortable that someone was in my home and doing God knew what. Eventually, after nearly an hour of that, 2 officers approached my home. And they were on foot too. I told them what I saw, and they went into the house. They told me to remain outside, and I did. I kept handing out candy and waiting on pins and needles for the cops to apprehend whomever was in my attic. It took a little while before the officers came back out. I was surprised that when they did, there was no one with them. They told me they had searched the whole house and my backyard, and they were unable to find anyone. I asked if they had checked the attic too, and they told me that they had. There was no one, and no sign of a break-in. There was no comfort in what they told me. Several kids had seen someone in the attic, and I had seen someone in the attic. I don't believe in ghosts, and I am not claiming there was a ghost in my attic. I think there was a person in there. When trick-or-treating died down, I was nervous going back in my house alone. I grabbed a kitchen knife, and I went to explore every room in the house. I found no one, just like the police had told me. I had made sure all the doors and windows were locked, but even that didn't help me feel better. I'd hear noises such as someone walking around. It was probably just the house settling, but my fear turned it into something more. If there was anyone in my house that night, I don't know how they got in and got out without leaving a trace. I don't know how any of it happened, but it was scary because anyone who can evade the police so easily would have no problem getting back into my house whenever they felt like it. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I want to apologize for not updating for a week, but as many of you know, my older brother passed away last week. I've had a bunch of stuff to deal with, and I wasn't able to make videos for a little bit. Still, I have 3 days left in October, so I'm still going to come out with a few new true story videos and some horror cliche theater which will debut later on tonight. And thanks to everyone who has passed along good wishes about my brother. My family appreciates it very much. My fellow narrators have been great too, and it truly means a lot to me. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. Comment on the video and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. You can always follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter using the links in the description. My email is there too, so if you have an original story that you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it there. And in the meantime, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.